If you're looking to stay informed with the latest analysis on the stories that are shaping our world in the areas of foreign policy, national security, and domestic politics, consider becoming a member of the DSR Network. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode across our more than 10 shows features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the latest topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code JULY2024 to receive 50% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code JULY2024. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. At the time we're recording this, we know little about the attempt to assassinate Donald Trump, which took place on Saturday during a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. Trump was hit in the ear, but thankfully he doesn't appear seriously injured. The 20-year-old gunman has been identified as Thomas Matthew Crooks, and all that's been released as of now is that he was registered as a Republican but donated $15 to a progressive group in January 2021. We know nothing of his motives. It goes without saying that political violence is absolutely unacceptable no matter who is targeted. It is the enemy of political freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. For now, we will focus on the bigger picture, whether this horrific event will lead to an escalation of politically motivated violence, what might be done about that, and what it says that American society is at this point again. So we're joined today by Zach Beecham, author of a new book called The Reactionary Spirit and a new piece for Vox called America is Not Ready for What Comes Next. Great to have you on, Zach.
Hey, Greg, I'm happy to be here. I mean, I wish it was under better circumstances, but, I'm happy to talk to you nonetheless, always.
Zach, even before the horrible attempt on Trump's life, a lot of experts were looking at January 6th and saying that our country could be looking at something akin to the Troubles in Ireland, a kind of protracted smoldering of violence that goes on for many years. I want to read from your piece where you suggest something similar. The ultimate fear is a cycle of violence akin to Italy's Years of Lead, a roughly 15-year period beginning in 1969 in which extreme left and extreme right militias perpetrated a spree of bombings and assassinations. Can you talk a little bit about why we might be headed this way and how likely that is?
Sure. I mean, the issue is that political violence is something, I read about this a bit in the book, actually. It tends to emerge out of a sense that the system is failing, whoever the person is, whatever their grievances are, whatever their cause is. Right? They feel, in addition to being a kind of angry, resentful person, just on an individual level, that their grievances are not being articulated and can't be addressed by the political system. The issue we have in the United States right now is that due to our extreme polarization, there are people, a small minority of people, I mean, the polling data is clear on this, a small minority of people, but a sizable, in a large country, nonetheless, minority of people who express willingness to take matters into their own hands because A, they feel frustrated by the system, and B, they hate the other side so much, so fundamentally, see them as an enemy, an existential threat, insert whatever your terminology is, that they believe that violence might be justified in this case.
So I should say, as of this recording, we don't know whether the shooter in Pennsylvania had any political motive of any kind. He could end up being a little bit like John Hinckley, who shot Ronald Reagan in the grip of delusions. But I think we do have to say this. A lot of Republicans are already rushing to declare not just that the shooter had political motives for targeting Trump, but also that President Biden and Democrats are broadly to blame for what happened due to their calling out of Trump as a threat to democracy. I want to ask you this. I mean, that's preposterous, but that aside, this kind of public conduct, this willingness to baselessly blame Democrats for the shooting, is itself a symptom of the kind of breakdown you're talking about that leads to more violence, right? It isn't just a few lone loons here and there or whatever. You need some sort of elite failure as well, right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, you've got people making the kinds of comments you described, like J.D. Vance, who's a senator and likely to be, according to the betting markets, the favorite for Trump's vice presidential nod. Tim Scott said something similar. So did Vivek Ramaswamy, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Like, really prominent people in the conservative world are talking in the way that you describe. And the thing is, even if we end up in a John Hinckley type scenario, right, or the shooter had some kind of inexplicable motivation, like we never really know, right, because there's no trail and his family members and loved ones don't even know themselves. It might not matter, right? Because what happens is once an event gets fed into the partisan maelstrom, right, it gets surfaced and recycled as the other side is to blame for this. It's their fault. And it's particularly true when elites push that narrative, right? It's hard to overstate how important elites are in formulating people's view about political violence, right? They determine how large the fringe is of people who are willing to go to these extreme measures, right? And there's a book about political violence in America by two scholars, Nathan Kalmo and Liliana Mason, where they study this exact question, and they find that messages that try to tamp down on violence from Republican elites specifically would be likely to lower the sense of threat among Republican partisans, and the same would be true among Democrats. Right now, Democratic elites are talking about how political violence is unacceptable, and how you see things like pray for Trump and hope he recovers from basically everybody, right? And what concerns me is the blaming of Democrats without evidence that's coming up from Republicans, because I mean, what we really don't want is a reciprocal cycle of violence. Like, that's the worst possible case coming out of this. And if this sort of vague rhetoric that you hear from some of them, like they tried to kill him, right? As if there's sort of this amorphous lump of different people who were all sort of corporately responsible, both for Trump's imprisonment, for trying to get him off the ballot, and now for killing him. Like, it's conspiracy. Right. And in times of polarization, people are likely to believe that no matter what the evidence says. And that's very, very scary. I mean, setting aside the fact that someone just tried to kill a former U.S. president, right? Like, that, you can talk about escalation, but that in and of itself is a terrifying sign of, and got awful close, of where we're at as a country.
I do want to step back a bit before we get back into what you're talking about there. And let's talk about your book. You document that the primary threat to democratic stability comes from the right, something you call the reactionary spirit. At the most fundamental theoretical level, reactionaries harbor a vision of human hierarchy and inequality, and so when democratic majorities seek to move the country towards equality, reactionaries are prepared to treat those outcomes as illegitimate and resist them by any means necessary. Can you talk about that big picture threat to democratic stability?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little field from the Trump stuff. So I want to bracket this and saying I'm not trying to use this to explain why anyone tried to shoot Donald Trump. But it does play a sort of general role in framing how we got to the political point in which polarization is so intense, right? And the basic argument I make is that democracy has, throughout its entire history, been beset by an essential contradiction between the basic promise of a society that's encourages human equality, that's really premised on the idea that everybody should have an equal say in governing ourselves, the collective project, and the fact that in any given society, when a democracy is created, there are hierarchies. There are some people who are better off in positions of power, who are treated better, who set the rules. Those two things are fundamentally in tension with each other. And so when democracies, as they often do, tend to encourage egalitarian political movements, those who favor the status quo distribution of power and wealth for whatever reason, right? They face a basic choice, right? And the choice is either, put democracy first and say, okay, we might lose on certain policy issues, but our job is to prevent the worst, what we see as the worst of those social changes, and even try to introduce elements that could strengthen what we see as best in the status quo. And that's the role of a normal conservative party, right? That's what conservative parties are supposed to do in democracies, and what helps them play a stabilizing role oftentimes, right? By pulling people away from the radical reactionary right. Then there's this other move, this impulse to say, to hell with democracy. We're willing to go outside it to try to protect what we see as sacred or essential truths about the world, that certain people deserve to be in positions of power, right? So that's what I call the impulse to make that move, is what I call the reactionary spirit. It's been on display in the United States quite a lot, especially since Barack Obama was elected president, and has played a major role in the cycle of reciprocal polarization, reciprocal escalation that has created this hyper-polarized climate, right? Because it's led not all Republicans, but certain elements of the Republican Party, and maybe even so its leadership, right, to engage in behavior that comes across as extremely threatening.
So in the aftermath of the Trump shooting, to connect this back, pretty much every single top Democrat, as you mentioned, has condemned the violence as an affront to small d democratic government. The moments in the years after January 6th, for example, or the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, we haven't seen the same response from many top Republicans. While some, of course, condemn the violence, and there are some, no question. On the other hand, Trump and many Republicans, particularly MAGA ones, have essentially said January 6th and Trump's incitement of it are rooted in legitimate grievances, aren't that big a deal, a tourist visit, and, critically, shouldn't be punished under our laws. I want to ask, to go back to your book, can we say that difference is rooted in the deeper theoretical divide we're talking about here, in which one side is simply far more prone towards casting out democratic outcomes than the other is?
I think that's right, that at this particular moment, the Democratic Party is a very broad coalition, ranging from the center and including even some formerly right-wing elements. Here I'm thinking of Never Trump, often former neoconservatives or current neoconservatives who have joined the Democratic coalition, all the way to the socialist left, right, the Democratic socialist left. And this kind of broad popular front style coalition has a tendency towards political stability, what they want, and what such an alliance wants, basically by its nature, because they can't agree on a lot of different substantive issues, is to preserve and protect the democratic system against a threat, right? And MAGAism, or whatever you want to call it, to me represents a very clear example of the reactionary spirit emerging in the United States and pushing measures that crash, that destroy the norms that underpin American society. Now, like, on the one hand, I feel bad talking about this in the immediate aftermath of an attempt on President Donald Trump's life, right? Like, here we are. The immediate question is, who tried to kill Trump and why? At the same time, we shouldn't let the fact of there having been a horrible, despicable, unacceptable assassination attempt cow us into not talking about the nature of the crisis of American democracy. And so we need to be able to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time, right? Like, one, the warnings that Democrats are offering about Trump and his danger to democracy are true and made no less true by the events of yesterday. On the other hand, right, Donald Trump at this particular moment, as hard as it is given his broader political persona, deserves a degree of sympathy, and it deserves the respect of any political leader who's been attempted to be killed. And the fact that he is a political menace does not mean that you should or extend any sympathy to the people who tried to kill him. In fact, it's essential that Democrats do what they're doing right now, and other progressives who are like them, to say, if you're really going to stand for democracy, you stand against political violence, which contravenes the very essence of what it means to live in a democracy, which is ruled by the people, not by force.
I want to endorse everything you said there, and also point out that this basic asymmetry is part of the crisis, right? Like, so the fact that Democrats are willing, including virtually the entire senior leadership of the Democratic Party, are willing to condemn violence when it's directed towards their political foes in a way that that senior Republicans simply are not. Again, there are some exceptions, but broadly speaking, it's more or less true. That itself is part of the crisis. I want to bring in a formulation you use in your book, and this applies to MAGA, I think, as a movement. One side is simply far more prone to cooperate democratically with the quote-unquote enemy, even if it means losing, and to respect democratic outcomes when it means losing, than the other is. And critically, this is a matter of fundamental ideological predisposition. I mean, that's your basic thesis, right?
Yeah, one way to think about democracy that I used the book, and I really like this. It's by a political philosopher, John Rawls, who's probably the greatest democratic theorist of the past 100 years, right? And Rawls has this concept of what he calls an overlapping consensus, which is that while you and I may disagree on some really basic things about the world, maybe we're from different religions, maybe we have very different baseline political philosophies, one is a Marxist, one's a liberal, another's a conservative, right? You can still agree at a certain point on the essence and the essential values of democracy, that political equality is important, that people deserve a certain degree of autonomy and freedom with respect to choices about their own lives and what the ways in which the political system can justly control them, right? And we can disagree on exactly how that plays out in principle, or how that plays out on specific issues. But basically everyone, from wherever they start, ends up agreeing on the premise of certain key democratic values, liberal democratic values, the things that we need to be able to cooperate with each other, right? And what defines, I think, a lot of politics in a healthy democracy is negotiating about the edges of where those principles rest and how they apply in particular cases. How high should the marginal tax rates be? What should we do about euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, right? These are hard questions for a democracy. And the Democratic Party is, for all of its faults, very clearly committed to resolving those things through the democratic process, right? It's part of the overlapping consensus. All of its different constituencies come into it from different origin points, different broader ideological stances, but they do align on that point. And there are parts of the Republican Party that do too, right? Like lots of Republicans who I might disagree with profoundly on all sorts of issues, when there's been instances of political violence directed at Democrats in the past, have done the right thing and said political violence is unacceptable. Even Trump gestures at that at times. But then he also, kind of makes fun of Nancy Pelosi after Paul Pelosi is attacked. And his son does it, Donald Trump Jr., more explicitly.
And also he wants blanket amnesty for all the January 6th attackers.
Right. Like there is an asymmetry here. There is a real deep and concerning asymmetry. What I worry about, and we don't know this, right, because we don't know anything about motive, I worry that some crazy person has taken this fear and totally misunderstood what the right response is to a threat to democracy. We don't have any evidence of that, right? It might not end up being that that's the case, but if that is the motivation that ends up being cashed out by this person, right, when we learn more about whatever his identity is, we have to insist on the inviolability of democratic principles, because that's what it means to fight for democracy, in part, is to behave by the rules, to adhere to the rules, to accept them even as they're broken by people on either flank.
If you're loving this show, then it's clear you value unique perspectives on the issues shaping your world. That's why you should check out The Intelligence, the free award-winning daily news podcast from The Economist and its global network of correspondents. And with a subscription to Economist Podcasts Plus, you can also get access to special limited series such as The Modi Raj, a brand new show introducing you to India's enigmatic strongman, plus The Economist's suite of in-depth weekly shows on business, China, American politics, and tech, all for just a few dollars a month. Search for Economist Podcasts Plus to sign up and start listening.
I want to pick up on a couple of things you said there. First, it is true that there are senior Republicans who do condemn the violence. And one example which we haven't cited of this is when you have Republicans coming out and saying that the prosecution of January 6th attackers should proceed apace. And you do have some Republicans saying that. But again, the MAGA movement, which is in control of the Republican Party, rejects that premise out of hand. The second thing I want to bring up is you alluded to the kind of Lincoln Project world of Republicans out there who are kind of now part of the Democratic coalition. I think it's worth stating as clearly as possible that the very reason that those Republicans are allied with us now is because they agree that democratic outcomes must be respected.
Yeah. I mean, that's the essence of that particular place of agreement, right? And so the question going forward, I think for a lot of people who are concerned about American democracy is how do you continue to make the case that democracy is on the ballot in a world where Republicans are saying anyone who says that is encouraging more threats on Donald Trump's life, right? And this is what I meant earlier about holding two thoughts in your head at the same time and articulating both of those thoughts at the same time, right? It is not the moment for message testing right now. Like, the United States is in the midst of a crisis. Again, a former president has been shot, right? Where we need to figure out how to deal with the immediate fallout, find out what happened, right? And why, because those questions are unanswered. We don't know why it seems like he was on a rooftop nearby, which is a familiar thing for anyone who knows about presidential assassinations in the United States. Why didn't the Secret Service do something about this? Why weren't they on top of this, right? And we don't know the answer to that question yet. And it's a huge looming one that needs to be taken really seriously. But there's still a presidential election, right? We're still in the midst of trying to decide who our next leader should be. And this all makes that a much more fraught issue because now the specter of violence is hanging over everything, right? The mutual distrust is going to deepen. Republicans will accuse Democrats warning about democracy, as they currently are, of trying to encourage future threats on Trump's life, even as they say, that's wrong. Don't do that. It does not follow from any principles of the defense of democracy that anyone has advocated. So there's going to need to be a set of reckonings with how this is processed and the threat that's generated by those comments themselves, right? Because now we have to be concerned of people who are saying, like Representative Mike Collins, that Joe Biden issued the orders to get Trump killed. Like, that's even worse than saying the Democrats' democracy rhetoric is to blame. It's saying that Joe Biden personally is responsible. So, goodness, I mean, what comes after this? Hopefully nothing, right? One thing that someone I know who's very smart on political violence in the United States says is, like, the perennial puzzle in American politics is not why we have so much political violence. It's why we have so little, given our extreme levels of polarization and easy access to guns, right? We have more than a lot of peer democracies, but it's still less than you would expect given those background circumstances. Now we have to worry that might escalate.
So in a deeper sense, is it fair to say that a key condition for sliding into more political violence is that one elite faction is not willing to condemn it when its own side exercise it towards its own enemies, and that's lopsidedly a problem on the right? Doesn't that itself potentially cause the downward spiral you fear?
Yeah, I certainly worry about the role that the normalization of January 6th protesters, the re-description of them as martyrs, has played in the American national image.
And patriots and heroes, Zach.
Yeah, patriots and heroes. It's mind-boggling, right? There are people who led what can only fairly be described as an insurrection against the United States, and now there's a movement to get them all pardoned if Trump wins again, to fundraise for them. It's very, 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 very bad, right? And it's symptomatic of an underlying situation of extreme polarization where the most extreme acts can be seen as forgiven. And now, as you're saying, it's really, really, really promising that no one on the Democratic side is doing that right now, and shows that despite certain attempts to like revise the political science on this, polarization is still asymmetric. Right. And I bet now January 6th apologism didn't emerge immediately, but I bet in a year from now, there will be no major figure in the Democratic Party talking about how good it was that somebody took a shot at Donald Trump. I would bet thousands of dollars on this point.
So you talk to a lot of experts about political violence. Is there some way out of the cycle as long as one elite faction is lopsidedly running rogue in the way we're talking about here? What's the way forward?
It's an extremely difficult question, right? The issue, I mean, one way forward is sort of muddling through, right? Because when we talk about radicalization based on public rhetoric or the statements of public figures, really what we're talking about is kind of a lottery, right? Where it's a question of some person hearing this stuff and then hearing it amplified in various different dark corners of the internet, and then they decide to act on their own. And so there's odds, right? There's always odds that somebody does that or doesn't do it. And so it might be the case that even with the Republican Party being the way that it is right now, and its recklessness in the face of a national tragedy, that no one will act on that rhetoric, and there won't be a cycle of escalation, right? In some ways, I think that might be the likeliest scenario, because we're always talking long odds when it comes to political violence here. They're relatively, partisan killings are relatively rare events, so that might be the easiest way out of this problem. But the problem is that the odds are always higher than they need to be, because of the underlying political situation. So what do we do to lower the odds? And I'm not sure there's a good solution while you're locked in the situation of existential conflict, right? I don't know what you do in a world where the Republican Party is a threat to democracy, where you do have to say that, and then they respond by saying that is putting our lives in danger, and how dare you do that, and you're not patriotic, right? Like, you're only not patriotic, you are the enemy, right? You are part of the they that tried to get Donald Trump.
Right.
But that is a very combustible situation. And short of someone like J.D. Vance or Vivek Ramaswamy suddenly becoming a responsible political actor, which, like, we can say the chances are basically nil there, the situation's going to remain volatile, right? It's going to remain much more dangerous than it needs to be. And that scares me. That really, really scares me.
I want to stress for listeners that we are recording this on Sunday morning, so it's based on what we know as of now. Also, I want to return to J.D. Vance for a second, because I think it illustrates the point you just made really well. Another really terrible factor here is the purging of the Republican Party of people who are willing to condemn political violence, or at least act legally against political violence on their side against the enemy, in quotes, right? The very reason J.D. Vance is in the running for Mike Pence's slot is because he is willing to apologize for January 6th, and Mike Pence was not, right? And so, to your point about how we're kind of really stuck in a very difficult dilemma as long as many Republicans, elite Republicans, are locked into this position, the purging of them really bodes very badly for the type of elite consensus to form against political violence that we really need to arrest any kind of downward spiral, don't you think?
Yeah, no, it's not good, right? It's really not good. It would be a much less scary situation if you could count on the elites of both parties to cooperate and trust each other and work together to attempt to limit the fallout of something like this, right? If there were a real national consensus that this is beyond the pale of American politics and needs to be downplayed and stigmatized, not, and there is, everyone is right now saying that this is bad. The problem is this coterie of actors who now speak for the dominant faction of the Republican Party, who are willing to say not only this is bad, but we need to hold the Democratic Party responsible, right? We need to, I don't know what follows from that. The rhetoric's often pretty vague about what should be done here, which is in and of itself worrying. But yeah, I mean, we have a what appears to be on the surface a consensus against political violence right now in the aftermath of the shooting, which is good. It is better than the alternative of people coming up and saying, now we need to fight the liberals, we need to take up arms, right? That kind of thing would be far more dangerous than what's happening right now. But so like, small favors. But what's happening right now is still unstable, and it's still bad. It still is exemplary of a level of mistrust, one that is essential to the way that the current Republican Party sells itself. Right? They feed off of this stuff in their particular political messaging choices and the way that they try to argue and describe American politics. That there's a very high likelihood of irresponsibility continuing for the remainder of the election, right? And maybe even beyond that. That's just the nature of the people who are involved here and the nature of the political personas they've crafted for themselves.
That's a key point right there, that Republicans, especially MAGA Republicans, that's essential to how they do politics. Everybody, make sure to check out Zach's book, The Reactionary Spirit. It's a good read. Anyway, Zach, well, let's hope that your prediction, or let's hope your suggestion that maybe we can muddle through here without a downward spiral turns out to be right. I don't know what we can do other than that. It doesn't seem clear to me.
Thanks, Greg. Like right now, we just have to hope. We have to hope and try to get people to act as responsibly as they can.
Well said. Thanks, Zach. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.